I wish I had heard Beryl's lecture before I had done some parts of my career, because I would have known how foolhardy they were. Nevertheless, have tried to work on some of this stuff. I want you to think about Beryl's presentation and just say, what would it look like if we called it growth instead of change? And how would that change the affect around it and people's willingness to invest themselves in it? Because I agree, if we talk about change, that's hard. If we talk about growth, that's natural, positive, and has to happen in order for yourself to move forward. And I think that's a little bit of the context I'd like to put in, talking about two changes within Firelight, implications for the organizational and the individual level. I don't have quite the matrix that Beryl did. And in fact, maybe I can keep that up here so you can be thinking about it as I speak. And again, I'll send you this the PowerPoint after today. Yeah. Now, I want to talk about two changes to the foundation. One, which is familiar to you, the move from foundation to public charity, and another one, which is a new theme, which is basically about program strategy. Moving from what I would call, and this is a caricature, I admit it, but a solidarity grant-making approach to a solidarity plus leverage. And I'll explain what I mean about that and the implications it has for the organization. And I would say, by the way, we have an expert in change at Firelight here in the person of Zanele, who has been there longer than me and who can tell you more objectively whether any of this has worked, especially in the way that it was intended. Of those two changes, the first one, the foundation to public charity, is primarily a reactive change, driven by the environment, by the economy. I'm trying to remember our terms from last, isomorphic, I think we could call it. The second is a strategic change, driven from the inside, changing how we want to do things. You could also call it heroic or tragically heroic, depending on how it turns out. But as Kent was saying in the first class, often you hear about leaders trying to make change. Also, you hear about leaders trying to deal with change that's happening around them. So let me talk to you a little bit again about the public charity shift. And I won't go into the details because we talked about that last time, but I would say it was driven by the economy, our income picture. It was driven by changing funding sources, so in that we were getting more money from foundation funders to us than our own money. And it was driven by fundraising prospects in the future, and especially the prospect of growth. Moving into that new format, the new form of public charity, in my judgment, then the boards increases our possibility of growing. So I want to talk to you about changes required of the organization because of that, and changes required of individuals. The organizational changes are many. First, how free are we to spend our money in the way we want? When Firelight started, it had its own endowment. It just drew the income from that. It could spend it on any grants it wanted. It could have no staff or some staff, and it didn't matter. And the public didn't really have a say in that. When we went to being a public charity, we were more constrained in terms of public perceptions, but also in terms of what our own foundation funders wanted of us. Where the money needs to come from is a second change for us as an organization. When you're a public charity, your money can't just come from one person or one foundation. It needs to come from a broad group of supporters. The actual details of the public support test are more complicated than the infield fly rule, so I won't go into them with you now, but just say we need a broad... Okay, well, they're more complicated than I have time for. We need a broad base of support. Governance changed. How did our board need to be composed? What did they need to look like to the outside? Could any of them be married to one another? Which, of course, in a family foundation was the case previously. A fourth thing that changed is how we need to communicate and how we need to tell our story. When we were a private foundation, it didn't really matter how we told our story. There wasn't a financial implication to us. But when we became a public charity and recognized that our resources were going to come from people we persuaded to give them to us, marketing became a word we had to figure out what it meant. Communications, We brought Robin on to help us with these things. So that was a big change organizationally. Now, when you have an organization that does things in the field and that raises money for them from other people, you have a program function and you have a marketing function. And anyone who's worked in a fundraising nonprofit can tell you there can be tensions between those two parts of the organization. The program people who feel that they have the truth and that they have the relationships and that they have the experience of what goes on the ground. The marketing people who say, we are the only ones who know how you can bring money into this organization and what you need to say in order to bring money into the organization. So there's a tension there that will always be there in a fundraising organization, and you need to manage it well so that you know that people won't always be on the same wavelength, but you need to harmonize and align as much as possible. And then, of course, a sixth thing that changed is how we are pegged, if you like, within the ecosystem. How people look at us, how they describe us. We have foundation in our name, but we're a public charity. Do people look at us as an NGO or a foundation, or if they're more fine in their description, as a grant-making NGO, which is really, I think, the most accurate way of describing what we are. Now, for individuals, there were also changes in what it was like to work at Firelight because of this. One, there's more scrutiny and more benchmarking when you're part of a public charity. Salaries need to be in line with salaries earned by others in your field, and salaries for nonprofits are lower than salaries for foundations. Your program admin ratio becomes very important, whereas in a private foundation, people don't look at that. All the sorts of metrics that people look at to decide whether they want to give their charitable dollars to you become very important. The organizational need to tell one's story becomes a personal need as well to tell one's story. There's more need to produce information, to get it to Robin in a form that she can put up on the website and that will be persuasive, to get a reaction from people about what we do, a positive reaction, to bring people along and to cultivate a followership. All of those are skills that our program colleagues and others of our staff were not hired for. And yet they need to show and use those skills. In our case as well, we've had to have more clarity about the distinction between board and staff roles. And I think this is just a natural thing where we are in our growth as an organization as well. When you start, often it's the board that starts an organization. And their volunteer labor keeps it going for a couple of years, and then you bring on a staffer and another, etc. But the board stays very close to what you're actually doing. They know the partners that you fund as well as you do. And then over time, you become more formally distinct in the ways that the textbooks tell you ought to be. And board does governance, staff does management. We have been going through a period of clarification on that. That's the things that I would say about the changes that have come about a bit in terms of the public charity, the Foundation of Public Charity. Now, the second change in our grant-making style, and Zanele, you chime in whenever you want to on this, because Zanele has been both the recipient of change management and a major force in making change within the organization. But my own personal conviction, which I felt in my previous work in the Netherlands, as well as a foundation director, is that foundations must leverage more than they can pay for in their grants. If you look at an endowed foundation, it keeps 95% of its assets out of circulation in order every year to have 5% that it can spend on grants. In the case of the Bernard van Leer Foundation in the Netherlands, that was $1 billion, of which 950 million stayed where they were, and 50 million might be spent in a year. In order to justify that, you really have to make good decisions about where you spend your money, and I'd say you have to bring about more change than you can buy with the money that you do spend. Now, I've approached Firelight in the same way, even though we're changing from an endowed foundation to a fundraising foundation, because we're still grant making, and I think the rationale is still quite solid. And the fact that we, with a 150 partner set, have a unique vantage point on how community-based organizations work. And a big part of our responsibility then is communicating what we know. So when I talk about leverage, basically I mean knowing explicitly how CBOs function, what's easy for them, what's difficult for them, their role in the ecosystem, and then using that knowledge to persuade others to orient more funding towards CBOs. This is a little bit of a foretelling of the next session on advocacy that we'll be looking at. If I look at Firelight when I came to it in 2008, I think it was a very solid, well-grounded organization. In fact, I would say better than the organization I had come from, in terms of saying why it did things, in terms of documenting, in terms of clear procedures. And I think it had very clear mission and values. If you asked almost anyone on staff, what do we do, why do we do it, and what are our core values, you'd get a consistent response from people. And that's not always the case within foundations. And I think it's a great strength when it does come together. There was a strong emphasis on enhancing the existing capacities of CBOs rather than trying to create something out of scratch. So I think those were the real strengths of Firelight, and as Beryl has said, those are the things that we've tried to preserve moving forward. On the, say, weaker side, I think there was a grand vision of an Africa where children were freer from poverty, where they had more opportunity, where it would be taken for granted that their life chances should be good as other kids. But there wasn't much pathway between what we did every day and where we wanted to get in terms of vision. And so I think one of the things we tried to do in the strategy we put together in 2008, 2009 was really make more explicit how do we think what we do every day leads to greater change. And again, this will feed into advocacy next week. I think we had done some very good advocacy work, in our case about the reaching out to the faith community, about community-based care rather than orphanages. But it was, I would say it was opportunistic rather than planned. So in 2009, we decided to add leverage and an explicit learning agenda to the strategy of the organization. Now, this, of course, brings about changes at the organizational level, but also at the individual level. The first thing is, I think it's very easy for an organization to say that they want to be, or they are, a learning organization, but it's a lot harder to actually set yourself up to be that. If you look at the lessons learned, this is a favorite quote of mine that Zanelli will recognize, the lessons learned section of almost any report or evaluation, it will tell you things you already knew that have very little empirical basis. It wasn't something that you learned along the way in a particular experience that leads you to that. You could have said it before. The standards for lessons learned are very low. And what we wanted to do in our strategy was to set the bar higher, to say, here are the things we want to know about. Here are the things we want to be articulate about. Here are the things we want to be the go-to organization on. I won't spend a lot of time on that. You can read it on our website about the learning agenda, but it really is to know deeply how community-based organizations work, how they decide what they want to do, how they decide how they want to do it, how they look at benefits, impact, how they decide how to work with government, and how an organization like ours can best support them. But to know that really backwards and forwards, if you like, for those questions to be the rosary of Firelight that we're asking all the time, every day, in different situations. Now, in order to do that, we had to adjust a lot of processes, and we had to change policies in the organization. Usually, a foundation will put a lot of effort into the processes that approve grants, and a small amount of effort relatively to the processes that evaluate the results that come out of those grants, and almost nothing into systematic learning. And we needed to turn that around. And Zanelli has labored in the vineyards for the last 3 years on that and done a super job along with her team. We had to think more about the ecosystem of actors that we work in. We are motivated, as you've been able to see, by the community level. But we recognize that's not the only level that matters for kids. What government does, either in terms of policy or services, has a tremendous impact. What international assistance does has a big impact as well. So how do we fit into that? How do we speak into that larger ecosystem? And part of that is enhancing our network of allies and influencers. And that's something we had to do. Think about ourselves less as simply the accompanier, if you like, of 100 or 200 organizations, but also the person who took learnings from that and convinced others to accompany as well. And we had to do something that I'm not very good at, I think, or I try anyway, which is to balance realism and ambition. And, I think, look, we're a small organization. We're 12 people in Santa Cruz County, 9 time zones from Africa, 3 time zones from Washington, not really in the middle of the action. So how do we figure out what an organization like ours can do and where the best levers are for us? And that was a big organizational question. In terms of changes for individuals, I've done kind of 12 years of trying to help foundations become learning organizations. And there are a couple of conclusions I've come to. And one is that there are certain personal competences and capacities that are better hired into an organization than you try to train them into people. One of those is curiosity. Another is analytical skill. Those are very difficult to incentivize. And if you try to, you run into the change situations that Beryl was talking about. There's a word in Dutch that I learned to my dismay called stroperig, which means molasses-like. And that was what change was like in some ways when you got someone who was hired to be a solidarity grant maker, to really just exist to help an organization out, and you ask them to be more curious, more analytical, take ideas out and see how we can play with these and convince other people to work. So one of the things is to really look at what you're trying to do and say, how much of this is it fair to ask people to stretch to? And to involve people in that discussion as well. But say, this is the way we're heading. These are the behaviors we will really value in the organization. We will go that way, but you have to go that way as well. Can we do it? There are also implications for how we spend our time. It's not just about being in dialogue with the partners we care about, but also thinking about, well, what does this mean for others, and how can we take out the lesson from a portfolio that I, as a program officer, might have of 30 grantees? How can I say what I think are the most valid learnings from that? How we assess partnerships. Again, it is good but not sufficient to be providing good services. But is there something that can be learned in a partnership? Is there a potential within that partner that is spreadable to other partners? And as when we're talking about the diffusion of innovations, is it laterally spreadable, adoptable from one organization to another without intervention from an outside funder? That's the most valuable thing. Because remember, we're talking about a network of several 100,000 CBOs. So if others can pick up a new idea or a new practice easily and without cost, that's very valuable to us. And I just one other thing, and then I can hand over to Kent. We need to manage, and I'd say Zanelli and I in particular, both board and staff anxiety that a learning agenda is either too abstract, dare I say too academic, or quixotic. What windmills are you tilting at here? And even if you learn these things, what difference will it make? I mean, and here it comes down, I think, a lot to conviction and what we think the role of our organizations actually is. But I think in our daily lives, the conversation comes up. And it comes back to the question of observability that Beryl was talking about. When people start seeing the value of learning in their effectiveness as an organization, that helps a lot. But it takes a while as well. I mean, we've been at this for 3 years, and I think it's only now really that we're starting to take off on it. I have a couple of reading recommendations that I'll share with you. One I want to mention right now, and the others you'll see in the PowerPoint. It's a book called Learning to Fly, and it's the best thing that I've seen about practical tips for knowledge management and learning, building a learning organization. Ironically, the guys who wrote it were working with BP previous to the Gulf. I think that it's really it's hurt their sales since all of this happened. But it's the most practical book I've seen about learning before you undertake a change, learning while you're in a change, and learning after you've gone through a process like that. So why don't I leave it at that?